you teach?
Oh, yeah.
Where, any particular place? Oh, did you? Oh, there. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Settlement there that,
Oh, wow.
you know, where the high school, Wayne Township, on Roscoe Road,
Yeah, okay.
just south of there, was enclave of homes, and that was the school.
Oh, wow. Well, I mainly look at the rural black belt in Alabama, which was kind of a lot of civil rights activity took place. So next Friday, right, yeah, I went to the 50th anniversary of that Freedom Summer, Mississippi last year. And I'm taking students next Friday to Selma. Hopefully we can get through. Oh,
So they didn't want to just come in and serve, they wanted to learn more about the community.
yeah.
So, and they wanted discussions about what African Americans had gone through that were served.
Right.
I talk about red line,
Yeah.
discrimination, and that did not happen.
Oh my God, it's still happening.
Yeah,
Really?
different name, but same tactic.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We went round and round. I finally stopped. I can't convince you of what my experience has been. It's just my experience.
Right,
So,
exactly.
you're welcome to believe what you believe. It's up to you.
Discernment, yeah, practice your own discernment.
Alabama, the sheriff profit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my research methods class this semester, we're doing some research for the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana, which has only been here for 3 years, but so many problems they have to address in fair housing. And I have a conference in April, and the keynote is Coach Herman Boone from the Titans. Yeah. So they're doing some good work. But I put my students into teams, and I gave them zip codes to do a little research on. So I'm interested to see what they come up with. They're a little nervous though, because they're like, "Where's that zip code at?" Figure it out.
Every census tract.
Yeah, the census tracts. Yeah, those census tracts are really, quite fascinating too, yeah.
I went to Butler my first year of college. When I went here, you could park anywhere. Now you can't park anywhere.
It's about to really get bad because they're building a parking structure, so they're removing a lot of parking spaces. The structure won't be finished till August.
Is that on the side of the
It'll be, yes, right. And then there's a housing structure going next to the library somewhere. So all of that parking is going to be eliminated.
amazing what happens when your basketball team does what?
Yeah, or doesn't. We have that experience too, yeah.
After they went to that Final Four.
Twice, yeah.
Yes, stay behind him.
Where's Jeremy?
Hey, Brett.
He wants to go back.
Okay.
Let's wait 5 minutes. Okay, we gotta wait a couple seconds. Co-president disappeared.
I'm a little tired.
Tim, you?
Yeah, we've got the fourth.
Good. How you doing?
Is this everybody, or does somebody belong in that?
Judge
There's
Rushing.
We'll slide out so you can slide in.
Judge, Your Honor?
Okay, are you ready? All right, guys. Eyes forward. Can you guys in the back row go down? Yeah, like half a person. There you go. All right. There we go. Couple more, guys. Let's see what we got here. You good?
All right.
Thank you all for the picture.
So Judge Shaheed, I asked them beforehand if there were certain questions that they were more comfortable with to start off, to lead the discussion. So some of them I got. I know that Wasima said that you like the stop and frisk question,
Yes.
for example. Do you feel also comfortable starting off with the Garner, yeah, the Supreme Court case, the indictment, the grand jury trial type question? Start off with that one too. Okay, so I think I've evenly spread it out.
Yeah, honey. Grand jury question.
I'm hoping people just come in a little late. I think the weather's deterred some people.
Yes, yes.
Snow's off and on today.
Oh, yeah, I don't think we've met.
I'm Terri Jett.
Terry.
Good.
Well, I think it is a big difference between.
My friend Daryl Campbell spoke very highly of you. Campbell. He said you're brilliant. He's
It's a fact.
He's with the IPS police and IMPD also.
Jim told us
Generous.
my good friend,
He's
public safety
brilliant.
director,
It's like, oh, I better do some research.
So I think, because so much of it comes from top down. So, Mark Hughes started.
This must be a little bit of a shock for you compared to California. How long have you been in Indiana now?
15 years, and it is a shock to me, yes.
I'm sure it still
But
is a
you
shock.
are correct. It is a shock. Oh, it is. Ooh.
The fact that Indiana has always dealt with.
This is unreal. Like, this has to be the worst. I thought last winter was just like horrible. And this, actually with the snow, hasn't been as bad. But the cold.
Yeah, temperature-wise, much
Yeah, it's not good for someone like me because I obsess over the weather. So I'm like 10-day forecast. Like,
My name is Cameron Alfred.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
My name is Cameron Alfred. I'm from the Collegiate, the student-run newspaper here. I just wanted to know if you guys would mind if I got to get with you guys sometime after the event. I don't want to take up too much of your time. It's really just like 5 minutes.
That's fine with me.
I mean, because I would just want to get some of your responses after the event. It'll just
so much, the group, they really appreciated that.
Very
token
least,
of
very
appreciation.
least we could do. Well, that's good. I'm glad that,
Yeah, it was
you guys
great.
sounded fantastic. Have you ever heard this guy play trumpet?
No.
Oh, man. His jazz band is outrageous, man. They're all
Wow.
ensemble, so.
What is it, halal?
It's kosher, it's halal, it's vegetarian. We had an interfaith dinner and we were trying to get the right menu and it had to, it was vegan, right? We went down to a vegan meal and everybody seemed to have a good time.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It was a wonderful, wonderful event, yeah.
I look forward to tonight's talk.
I guess I didn't even notice that was you over there. And of course, it was you. Yeah, I was running late. Did you know that? What?
That's the main thing, but then sound like you get people.
Yeah. But you know, for events, a lot of things are perks. Maybe I'm just getting old. I don't know. But you know,
You're exactly right.
you're sitting there talking good.
The tough part about it is when you do that sort of, as my wife said, probably too much information. But the difficult part is when you do it stuff like what we did, you don't really have the sophistication of safety that you want going into the sound check because, the way it works for main events, they have the sound is coming through the mics are going into the mixers, and then there's somebody at the controls that does a sound check and all that is kind of set before you start. But we just show up. I don't know how far close to get to the mic.
I know, it's too many. I think I've overdone it. Because I'm already like confused. All of a sudden one question came in my head and now I have to dig for the answer. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start in about 5 minutes, but we do have cookies and water, so please help yourself while you wait. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. You too.
David Shaheed.
Nice to meet you, Chairman. Nice to meet you.
Douglas Hairston.
Thank you all for coming on tonight, too.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Yeah, move away from the TV screen next time. There we go. All right, here we go, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank
amazing the number of musicians that are, you know, like known musicians. They can't believe it.
The front row here has a lot of seats if anybody needs to sit. It's first class. It's free today.
Yeah. That's the thing. You know, 'cause I had all my girls studies. Suzuki meditation and everything. They both, all of them started out with violins, except for the last one. And then one of them did cello. Stayed in choir, and the other one took piano. They had all their teaching skills. Isn't it stuff?
Yeah. 81-year-old Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize winner, Archbishop Emeritus, international voice for peace, racial equality, and reconciliation, and the inspiration for a new academic center in Indianapolis designed to be an incubator for social justice. Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary created the Desmond Tutu Center to honor the Archbishop Emeritus's legacy of justice and reconciliation. In 1978, Desmond Tutu was named General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches and became a leading spokesperson for the rights of Black South Africans. During the 1980s, he helped lead the anti-apartheid movement, and in 1984, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The Desmond Tutu Center at Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary will focus on leadership development in social justice and reconciliation, international relationships, and interreligious bridge building. South African cleric and anti-apartheid activist Alaa Wafa will serve as the center's first director. The presidents of Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary say the neighboring schools are currently exploring several opportunities to collaborate academically. The announcement of the new center was made at Butler's Clues Hall in front of a sold-out crowd of 2,100 people. The Archbishop Emeritus was on hand for the honor and spoke to the crowd.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Wasima Ali, and I'm the Administrative Director of the Desmond Tutu Center for Peace, Reconciliation, and Global Justice. On behalf of Butler University and the Christian Theological Seminary, I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. In light of the recent events unfolding around our country, the DTC felt that this was a critical time to explore the values of equality and justice, tenets that were fundamental to the inception of our nation. Through today's panel discussion, we will explore current issues which must be understood at a root level in order to formulate constructive steps forward that we as individuals, as institutions, and as a nation can take together. DTC's Executive Director, Dr. Alan Buzak, who is slated to address this audience later tonight, unfortunately will not be able to join us due to illness. The DTC is extremely proud and grateful to have Dr. Buzak serving as our Executive Director, so please make sure to follow his work and the work of the Desmond Tutu Center by visiting our website at www.desmondtutucenter.org. You can also find us on Facebook, the Desmond Tutu Center, and Twitter at the Tutu Center. Before I introduce our moderator this evening, I would like to point out that we also have refreshments and that restrooms are going to be on the main floor. I would also like to acknowledge our partners in this, Butler University's Black Student Union, Butler University's Demia, a women's social justice group, and Christian Theological Seminary's Black Student Caucus. I would also like to recognize the Equality and Justice Research Team, Danya Soltaji, Leah Levy, and Rebecca Randall. In addition, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists, definitely the stars of today's event. And I would like to thank you for not just accepting our invitation, but also for the work that you do and will continue to do. With that, I would please request that you silence your phone as I introduce our moderator, Ms. Alaa Wafa. Alaa is currently Associate Counsel at Cummins in the Legal Department in the Indianapolis office. She also serves on the Board of Directors for the Center for Interfaith Cooperation. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a double major in political science and international relations. After completing her bachelor's, she worked as a staff assistant and later legislative correspondent on Capitol Hill in DC. She then pursued her degree in law from Michigan State University with a concentration in international and comparative law. With that, please welcome Ms. Alaa Wafa.
Thank you, Wasima, for that introduction. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So good evening, everyone. I want to thank the Desmond Tutu Center for inviting me to moderate this esteemed panel on such an important topic affecting our society today. As most of you know, last year on July 17th, Eric Garner, while resisting arrest for selling loose cigarettes, was put in a chokehold and tackled. He died shortly thereafter. His last words, "I can't breathe," became engraved in America's collective consciousness as a symbol of the suffocation and injustice African Americans have felt at the hands of our justice system. Those words were memorialized with the Twitter hashtag, "I can't breathe." Then on August 9th, 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot dead in Ferguson, Missouri by police officer Darren Wilson after stealing cigars from a local convenience store. His shooting sparked protests and national Twitter campaign of the hashtag Black Lives Matter and brought a national conversation on race relations to the forefront. This national conversation continues at all levels of society. Just this past Sunday at the Oscars, after a powerful performance of the song Selma, singer and artist John Legend noted that, quote, "We live in the most incarcerated country in the world. There are more black men under correctional control today than there were under slavery in 1850, end quote. There are clear pains felt by African American communities in this country today, and we cannot move forward as a community if we don't attempt to discuss these issues and learn from them. Today, we plan to delve deeper into some of the questions around mass incarceration, excessive use of force, unarmed shootings, and racial profiling. I'll ask the panel a set of questions, and each panelist will have a few minutes to respond to each question. Then, after 45 minutes or so, we'll open up the discussion to the audience for a question and answer session. And now, without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel. Our first panelist is Douglas Hairston. Serving as the current director of the Front Porch Alliance, Minister Douglas Hairston has led the mayor's faith-based and community initiatives for the city of Indianapolis since 2008. Minister Hairston has taken leadership roles in the community, including serving the Mount Zion Baptist Church as an Associate Minister of Community Outreach, in the position of President and Executive Director of Jobs Partnership of Greater Indianapolis from 2001 to 2008. Minister Hairston developed collaborations across cultures, denominations, community groups, and service agencies. Minister Hairston brings years of leadership experience in the areas of ministry, nonprofit organizations, technology, and marketing, along with creating partnerships with government, business, faith leaders, and community organizations. The boards he served on include the Mayor's Reentry Task Force, Marion County Commission on Youth, Child Protective Services, Child Protection Team, and Local Investment Support Corporation's Comprehensive Investment Committee, Indiana Coalition for Human Service Providers, Coalition of Homelessness Intervention and Prevention, Interagency Urban Agricultural Committee. Minister Hairston currently serves on the Center for Interfaith Alliance as the chairman of the Purdue Extension of Marion County and is the mayor's liaison to the White House for the President's program, My Brother's Keeper Initiative. So I have them written down out of order, so I'm going to do Dr. Terri Jett next, who's the third from the right. Dr. Jett is an associate professor of political science at Butler University. Dr. Jett is also an affiliate faculty member of the Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies program and the Peace and Conflict Studies program, a member of the Collaborative for Critical Inquiry into Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Class, and a special assistant to Provost Morris for Diversity and Inclusivity. She teaches courses on U.S. politics with a focus on the experiences of African Americans and other ethnic minorities, such as Black political thought and the politics of Alice Walker. She also teaches a senior seminar on political humor and an honors course on the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March, where she takes students to the annual Jubilee celebration. Her research focus is on post-civil rights movement experiences of African Americans in rural communities in the southern U.S., and she's currently writing on the recent settlements of Black, Native American, women, and Latino farmers against the United States Department of Agriculture for discrimination. Dr. Jett has a BA in Ethnic Studies and a Master's in Public Administration from California State University, Hayward, and a PhD in Public Policy and Public Administration from Auburn University. She's president of the board for the American Civil Liberties Union of Indiana, is on the Indiana Debate Commission, and is an elder with Witherspoon Presbyterian Church. To her right is Judge David Shaheed. Judge Shaheed is a civil court judge since 2007, has worked as a judicial officer in several capacities in the Marion County Superior Court in Indianapolis since 1994. After serving as a master commissioner and magistrate, Judge Shaheed was appointed as a criminal court judge in 1999 by Governor Frank O'Bannon. Judge Shaheed began his career as a staff attorney for the Indiana Department of Workforce Development and managed the DWD Office of Legal Counsel, and later was appointed Chief Administrative Law Judge for the Department of Unemployment Insurance Appeals. Judge Shaheed was of counsel with Lee Burns and Counsel prior to joining the Marion Superior Court in Indianapolis. In 2007, the Indiana Correctional Association chose Judge Shaheed as the 2007 Judge of the Year for his work with ex-offenders and defendants trying to recover from substance abuse. Judge Shaheed has been a lecturer and presenter on a variety of legal and interfaith topics. He earned his BS from the University of Evansville and his JD from Indiana University in 1985. Last but not least, we have Mr. Robert Turner. Robert Turner Jr. is a practicing attorney and the former director of public safety for the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. Prior to his appointment as the director of public safety, Mr. Turner served on the police force for over 30 years and amongst many distinctions worked as the of white-collar crime fraud branch commander, director of training for the Police Training Academy, lieutenant for the Community Relations Unit, Chief's Office Narcotics, and vice branch commander for the Criminal Investigations Division. His official training includes public records and policymaking, community policing, national action for safety and security in American cities, and managing the legal risks of law enforcement. In 1981, Mr. Turner received his Juris Doctor from Indiana University School of Law. And without further ado, I'm going to start with the questions. So this first question deals with mass incarcerations. The United States, as I mentioned, has the highest incarceration rate in the world. In the past 40 years, the number of crimes hasn't skyrocketed, but the number of people behind bars has. In fact, according to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, the prison population in the United States was less than 500,000 in the early 1970s, but is now over 2 million. Over half of the crimes are nonviolent, with a relatively large percentage dealing with drug possession offenses. even more troubling is the evidence showing that incarceration is carried out primarily on people of color, and particularly young African American men. According to the 2010 U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, black males had an imprisonment rate that was nearly 7 times higher than the incarceration rate of white males. And the rate of incarceration of black women was nearly 3 times that of white women. The statistics are disproportionate despite data from the Human Rights Watch showing, for example, that African Americans commit drug offenses at the same rates as those of people of other races. So let's start with you, Dr. Jett. Does the criminal justice system play a role in the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans? What factors do you believe play a significant role in such incarceration rates? And are there systemic changes or other solutions that may help to amend the crisis?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important that we look at the connection between our educational system and the criminal justice system, because we can see a direct path, a direct causal path and correlation between the heightened number of African American youth in particular that are suffering under these policies of suspension rates and this just increasing policing at the educational level, and see that there is what we like to call a school-to-prison pipeline that has taken place and has been going on for years. And so if we start there and we look at the number, the disproportionate number of African American and Latino youth in our school systems that are suspended, the rates that they are suspended and expelled, then we can see that there's a line that goes from the juvenile justice system to the adult justice system. We also have other policies that we've had in place for a while that have been disproportionately implemented. We have senseless drug laws that have been enforced against a lot of communities of color. We also have this increase in what we like to call debtors' prisons, where we have a number of people that have been confined due to things that have to do with economic disparities. So we can also look at the connection between economic inequality and also the disproportionate effect on people of color in terms of our incarceration rates in the criminal justice system. And then we also have this other issues that we are going to address in this discussion, this panel, in terms of racial profiling that has taken place, that has targeted communities of color in terms of the policing efforts. And we have this term that's thrown around that's called community policing, but it doesn't tend to be thought of in the same way in a lot of neighborhoods that have larger populations of African Americans and also Latinos. And so if we look at all of these factors, suspension rates, these problems at the educational level, K through 12 in particular, and then we also look at these census drug laws, the war on drugs that we've had, if we look at the increase in debtors' prisons, and also if we look at economic inequality, we can see that all of these factors sort of weighing in together have affected the disproportionate number of African Americans in particular, since we looked at that group that have ended up incarcerated. And then also there's these mandatory minimum sentence laws, disparities in the way that those have been affected that have all weighed in together to affect African Americans.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
And would anyone else like to add to that, not only the factors, but I think perhaps what changes can be made to address those disparities that you're talking about in terms of the school system and the drug laws, for example, that are unfortunately targeting certain people?
The one thing I would add is that within, I think in 2014, the Indiana legislature did a major overhaul, a major revision of the criminal code. And the purpose of those revisions was to address some of those issues and problems that were addressed by Dr. Jett. And the essence of it, in short, is to decriminalize, in some respects, nonviolent offenses, nonviolent crimes, so that instead of sending those people to the Department of Corrections, those people would if found guilty, would serve their sentences locally through community corrections. And so the idea is for nonviolent offenders that are suffering from substance abuse, that those crimes be dealt with differently than violent crimes. And so that prison would be saved for the violent offenders. They would go off to DOC, but for those people who were convicted of drug offenses, those sentences would be served locally through community corrections, home detention, work release, probation, and so forth.
Also, if you look at the application, just after slavery, of course, we had the 13th Amendment that was supposed to abolish slavery, but there is a clause in the 13th Amendment that says, except for those who are convicted of felonies. So it's almost like a reinstitution of slavery on those who are incarcerated. And you have also the rise right after slavery of loitering laws and indigent laws, and the increase in felonies put on to African Americans just through negotiation of a criminal conviction. And so you recreate a slave system in people that have been incarcerated by being able to use cheap labor. Slavery was really about cheap labor. It was about building up the economics. And so in the South especially, the incarceration, the mass incarceration of individuals who have just come out of slavery for just being indigent, put them back on chain gangs and help build roads and in factories and those type of things. And so that behavior has continued, in some cases unchecked, until the 70s and 80s, and some would argue even today. So even as you have an individual who is a juvenile, they can be found true in the court of law, which in the juvenile court, that's similar to being having a conviction or being found guilty. And that violation may not have happened on school property, yet because they have a violation of true or a conviction of true, they are suspended or expelled from school, and that takes them out of the opportunity to improve their situation through education. You also have individuals who are in school who are kicked out of school and expelled because they have not been to school enough. So now you are punishing somebody who hasn't been to school enough by keeping them out of school. And all of these things compile upon each other to create the channel from education to incarceration, rather than addressing some of those systemic items that we have. Even the word equality is based upon what you think equal is. Is this equal to that? Equality under the law gives it some teeth that we can now balance out one's own belief to what should happen.
With respect to at least the criminal justice element, when you look at crime in the context of what you see every day on the news, the violence, particularly the drug-related violence, most people don't think about the fact that the drug houses are not in every neighborhood. When you go to 86th and Meridian Street or Geist, very rarely do you see a crack house in that neighborhood because the neighborhood's not going to tolerate it. However, in the neighborhoods where there's high unemployment, the lower economic level, where they don't really feel that they are part of society, you do find that drug houses are there because there's mass unemployment or underemployment, so they simply create their own self-employment. When a crack house opens in a neighborhood, that neighborhood becomes infected. Most people think that drugs are victimless crimes, nonviolent, but crack is so addictive that at a particular location where they sell it, it's going to be the target of robberies. The crack house will trade crack for weapons. People will break into cars and homes and steal weapons and anything else they can use to trade or barter at a crack house. They will snatch purses. So immediately around the crack house, crime goes up. police officers become, I guess, to a great extent prejudiced because they go into certain neighborhoods, they see certain type of people, and they know the crime rate is high. We had 12 homicides here last month, but they don't associate with the crack use, they associate it with the people. Unfortunately, many years ago, when we were talking about lack of opportunities, particularly for blacks, Martin Luther King said that there was a class of people suffering from a degenerating sense of nobodiness. They felt there were nobody in America. And that's why nobody participates to a lesser extent in the government of America. They don't think they're recognized. I don't see the black men in high-level positions in the Fortune 500 companies, Eli Lilly, you don't see it. But when I go to jail, and I'm there probably more than most, I do see it. Heavily populated, and when they are arrested for minor crimes, and I find with, particularly in the lower economic neighborhoods where the crack house and drug houses are, when police stop a car that has a small bit of marijuana in the car, they arrest everybody in the car, even though it could have been stuck on one person's shoe. And because the people are unemployed greatly and don't have money for bonds or attorneys, they usually plead guilty because they're told, well, we're not going to give any time. Well, why pay a bond? Why pay an attorney? I'm going to get out. But that drug conviction labels them, so they become more unemployable and more of a nobody. So as you look at all of this, the balance in terms of education and employment affects what happens in the communities. I noticed that, and I was a policeman for many years in the roughest part of Indianapolis. That rough part where the homicides and shootings and drug houses were very high crime. Those homes have now been remodeled, and they're worth $500,000, $600,000. Same neighborhood. Guess what? No crime. No crack houses. Because the same people don't live there anymore. The people that live there are working, they keep up their neighborhoods, they pay attention to what's going on, and they feel like they're somebody. So in America, we need to make everybody somebody.
I do want to add one little thing. Yes, gentrification is an important issue that we do need to address also. When you I think, mentioned this figure of 2 million, I think.
Over 2 million.
Yes, and if we look at the correctional population, broadly understood as those under supervision of adult correctional authorities, meaning probation and parole, there's actually 7.1 million that are in those positions. And so when we start thinking really critically about our prison industrial complex system in that way and looking at all of the numbers, then we can see that we do have a true systematic problem that is connected to all of the other issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question deals with the stop and frisk law, also known as the Terri stop. So a law known as the Terri stop in New York essentially allows police officers to briefly stop, question, and frisk a person based on a reasonable suspicion that that person may be involved in some sort of criminal activity. Many civil rights groups have more recently been challenging these laws in court. Critics say that the law targets minority communities, and specifically the African American and Latino communities. A district court in New York even went as far as to hold the law unconstitutional. However, that decision was later overturned by the Court of Appeals. Turning to you, Judge Shaheed, are the concerns surrounding the stop and frisk law justified? Is it the law itself, or perhaps how that law is applied? And can you please shed some light on some of the current concerns or challenges surrounding these laws and provide some insight on maybe how they can be addressed or remedied?
Well, the short answer with respect to stop and frisk is the problem is not with the law, but it's how it is applied. And for those who really want to delve into this, if you Google Adrian Schoolcraft, 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 and NYPD, you can find loads of information on this particular point. Because the case that you're referring to, the reason why there was the case in New York City that was subsequently appealed was because Adrian Schoolcraft was a police officer with NYPD, and he started taping their roll call meetings. And it's kind of a long story, but to give you kind of a capsule of what's involved, the gentrification issue that my good friend Bob Turner talked about, with respect to how mayors are viewed in today. It's an interesting subject, but Mayor Rudy Giuliani was associated with what was referred to as the broken window syndrome. And that is, if you target low-end crimes, you can change the environment in a community, because those low-end crimes tend to lead to bigger crimes. In other words, a broken window is a symbol of something that is broken in the community. So he started focusing on minor crimes, and it really escalated to the point where the police department was trying to keep the numbers with respect to of arrests and convictions high, but then they were also trying to keep down the number of violent crimes, in other words, rapes and violent crimes against people. And so I don't have time to go into all of it, but if you just Google Schoolcraft NYPD, you can find plenty of information about it. So it had gotten to the point in New York City that at these roll calls, what they would do is the officer that was in charge of roll call, he would say the numbers of arrests that we're going to need today. And so police officers would go to a community, surprisingly, not surprisingly, a black community in New York City, and basically with a wagon just round up people, take them down to the police station, and then just start running warrant checks to see who had outstanding warrants. And if they had outstanding warrants or if they had drugs on them, those people would go into the count to show that the police were really doing their work. And that had big impact economically in two dimensions. One is on the tourism side, because if you have good numbers with respect to policing, people will say that the city's safe and they can come to your city to visit. And then also it shows that the police is being very effective with respect to policing the community. And then also if they're safe communities and people want to live in these neighborhoods, and with gentrification, that's a big issue. So the issue is not so much stop and frisk, but it's how stop and frisk is implemented. Because all of us really want safe communities. But what happens is when you have a kind of a distortion or perversion of what the purpose of the law is, then you get into situations where people don't trust the police, and when people feel that they're being improperly targeted, as was well documented in the case in New York City with that stop and frisk.
Just quickly, one of the things that it appears that this stop and frisk policy has really done is try to shortcut the idea of community policing. When a community has officers from that community working in that community, there is a level of accountability and knowledge of the individuals who live there, who grew up there, went to high school with the individual, that holds people in some ways in check. Because I know your mom, I know your dad, I grew up with them, so you better straighten up or I'm going to go tell them. And it worked for me when I was growing up. There were 3 officers on the force that worked in our neighborhood, and they knew all of the parents. They went to high school with them and all those type of things. We don't have that as much in Indianapolis. We have a lot of officers who are hired from outside the city limits that have come to a place to get a job, to be a police officer, and they don't have a level of respect for the community and the people, and many times they have a disdain and a fear. And so especially when you have a fear of somebody, you aren't going to talk to them in a respectful manner, which escalates the situation. Maybe you misuse your authority. But when done well, and I've seen many of our IMPD officers do this quite well, connect with an individual, that they have to address. Find out not what happened, but what's happening, and be able to create a relationship in the community that's valued, not disvalued. And so the stop and frisk is more of a shortcut to try and get around community policing, but there's no substitute for solid relationships built upon respect and knowledge of the community.
When the Supreme Court made the decision in Terri versus Ohio, based on the Fourth Amendment, it was because, of course, they certainly want to protect everyone's privacy, but they understood that a police officer, if he encounters someone on the street that might be dangerous, about to commit a crime, a robbery, for example, it would be unreasonable to require that police officer to talk or interview that person while that person is armed. It would be a threat to the police officer's life. So they gave police authority under those circumstances if, in fact, they had reasonable belief that that person was, in fact, considering committing a crime, conduct, looking in the windows, whatever. And I think in Terri it was a store. The person was walking back and forth in front of a store looking in. They wanted the police to have the authority to stop that person, investigate, but also to pat that person down for officer safety. That's what it was for. However, today, that stop and frisk has been greatly expanded. Now police officers say they find marijuana on people. I just doing an investigative stop. I patted him down for officer safety and found marijuana. Now, I've never seen anybody killed with a marijuana cigarette unless they choked on it. So the police officers expand these theories and now finding cocaine and crime, drug paraphernalia on people, again, in certain neighborhoods based on Terri versus Ohio. And it's not sustainable. Some officers say that they can feel that it's marijuana. Well, I worked narcotics. I was in charge of it. I was deputy chief of criminal investigations. And today, if I felt something in someone's pocket, I could not tell that it's marijuana. But that argument has been presented in court, and judges fell for it, with all due respect, Judge. So I think we've gone a little further than the Fourth Amendment allowed in Terri versus Ohio. I think Terri versus Ohio is a good, it's a good ruling. I have no problem with it. The theory of broken windows, and again, you're talking about a high crime area, like the neighborhoods we're talking about where the homicides are and the drugs are. If police officers see a minor crime, even a traffic violation, and do a stop, it's very likely in those neighborhoods that there's possibly other criminal things, criminal elements going on. You might smell something in the car. You might see a gun. And it does lead to an arrest sometimes that could prevent a homicide. And we're trying hard to prevent homicides. But sometimes we try too hard because we disrespect the Constitution. So I think it's very important for police to apply the law. They should be trained properly on what Terri versus Ohio actually means. And they should not violate people's rights, because you find it's not being done across the board everywhere in the city of Indianapolis. If they stop you, for example, again, at 86th and Meridian, they probably won't pat you down for a traffic stop, but if you're stopped in some of the neighborhoods at 30th and Keystone in the middle of the night, you probably will be patted down, and your car will also be inspected. Again, it's an inspection that the Supreme Court allows for officer safety, looking under the seat, making sure there's no gun there, but the officers take it too far.
Thank you. This next question addresses excessive use of force, and it's actually a two-part question, so I'll break it up and address it to multiple people. Allegations of the use of excessive force by police departments towards African Americans continue to generate media headlines. On an individual level, we previously talked about Ferguson and Michael Brown, who was shot dead shortly after stealing a few cigars from a convenience store and then engaging in an altercation with a police officer. In New York, Eric Garner was in the process of being arrested for selling loose cigarettes when he was put in a chokehold, dying soon after. In Phoenix, Arizona, Romaine Brisbane was shot dead after an altercation where the police officer mistook a pill bottle for a gun. So, Mr. Hairston, a lot of these questions are begging the question, Are police engaging in excessive use of force? Is this a growing trend? And is such force being applied unequally to different races?
So let's not generalize. I mean, there are some police officers who have a history of using excessive force. But by and large, the majority of the police officers that I know go out of their way not to use excessive force. 2 weeks ago, we had a situation where a young man drives up with a dead body in front of the city-county building. He has a gun. There are multiple police officers right there. They did not shoot him. He got out of his truck with the gun, brandishing the gun, but he was not shot. Why is that? And that was from good police officers working the situation as it is and not making it something that is not, or escalating it. They de-escalated, they addressed him, and they worked with him in order to stabilize the situation so nobody else was shot. And so there are methods and police methods and good police officers out here that are doing their best to make sure that they are using their wit and their knowledge and their ability to communicate with the individuals to make sure that the violence doesn't come about or is escalated. So there are some officers that need additional training. And there are some officers that may not be really suited to be in a officer's uniform. But by and large, it comes down to the training and the application of those training with good men and women who have the community's best interests at heart and the individuals' of interest at heart as well, as their own safety. And because you don't have to use a gun all the time. You don't have to use pepper spray, a taser. You have so many other options available to you. And our best in the blue are doing just that. They're using all the options they have available to them so everybody can be safe and go home safely that night.
The one thing that I would add is it helps the community appreciate the concept of community policing, because if when these unfortunate incidents take place, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not an eyewitness to any of them, but the one common denominator that I sense is that the officer felt uncomfortable or in fear, or at least that's what the language is, that the officer felt in fear for his life. And that really speaks to two things for me. One is a training issue, and the other is a cultural sensitivity issue. Now, the training issue comes in how to de-escalate a situation. You know, Bob Turner can probably speak to it much better than I can. But my understanding is that officers are trained in terms of how to de-escalate a situation. And instead of going from 0 to 100 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour is pulling out a weapon with the intent to use it, there are a number of training issues that they're exposed to in terms of how to calm a suspect down, how to take control of the situation without a weapon. A good example of that is with respect to mental health issues. Unfortunately, there was an incident within the last 30 or 45 days about an individual who had mental health issues. The officer felt in fear and shot this person. In Indianapolis, I can't speak of other communities, but in Indianapolis, I know that officers go through what we call crisis intervention training, called CIT teams. And those officers are trained to spot an individual who might be suffering from mental health issues. And so instead of treating that person as a suspect in a criminal incident, they treat that person as a person that may have some mental health issues, may not be on their medications, may be having a bad day. But they know how to interact with that person in a way that de-escalates the situation so that they can get the person the help that they need, maybe not even arrest the person, but may get the person off the street, may get them to a homeless shelter and so forth. So I think a lot of this is training, but also there's an impact with respect to cultural sensitivity in terms of being able to be in neighborhoods and understand, as you know, my friend Harrison was saying, know who those people are and have some context as to the people in that community and the neighbor, the families and the various individuals that they come in contact with.
And by the way, the CIT officers are available. If you dial 911, you can ask for a CIT officer, and they will come.
I'd like to follow up also. I think it's so true with regard to community policing and cultural sensitivity because we have so many white police officers killing unarmed black men. And so we need to think about why is that happening. And I think it does have to do with, naturally, excessive use of force, but also the increasing militarization of the police, that they're getting more and more types of equipment that is seemingly unnecessary. There's an organization called Free Thought Project that did a federal 1033 request, I think that's the form, to get information on how much excessive property has been coming from the federal government, I think under the Department of Homeland Security, could be another department, down to the local levels in terms of military equipment that's excessive, that they've been sending down to local communities. And if you just go into their website and you can go, it's state by state, county. I looked at Marion County. The list just goes on and on and on. I think we even got some here at Butler University, our police department. So we need to think about, you know, what do they need all of this militarized type of equipment for? And of course, if you're going to receive that equipment, then you're going to use it. Why wouldn't you? You're not just going to let it languish. And so there's all these factors, racial profiling, excessive use of force, increasing militarization. It is all playing together.
I'd like to interject here. So I've heard from Judge Shaheed this common denomination of fear. Dr. Jett, you mentioned greater increase in weaponry used by the police force. Looking at differences between some of these matters, in the Garner case, there was video footage of the death. And some say this footage played a role in the fact that statistically, more people felt that the force used in the Garner case, as opposed to the Brown case, was excessive and the death unjustified. Do you believe that footage played a role in this difference? And would some of the existing tension that currently exists and the mistrust that exists, could that be alleviated by police wearing body cameras? And this is open to anyone.
Well,
Go ahead, Doug.
the body cameras, I have two thoughts with respect to the body cameras. And in a street environment, you know, for an officer that is doing a traffic stop, I can see where the body cameras would have perhaps a constructive role with respect to taping the complete incident, and so that everyone can be able to see what happened. The difficulty I have with body cameras more or less being live all the time is a point that Bob Turner mentioned, that is with the Fourth Amendment, you know, which is the viewed as lawyers by search and seizure. In other words, there can be no search or seizure associated with an individual's property or their residence without probable cause. And the problem with the cameras, if they're live 100% of the time, there's a potential for abuse, because if an officer goes to a residence with their camera live and then is just inquiring about anything, you know, there was a lost dog, somebody was complaining about noise, and they've got their camera going and they go into a residence or they go into an apartment, that information that's picked up on the camera can be used later to be dissected by, say, you know, the drug task force or officers that are doing any kind of investigation to look at what's on that tape to see if there are incidents of other kinds of criminal activity. So I think the proper way to do it is have the camera on so it's on all the time. But if you have it on all the time, then there's the potential for an invasion of privacy, because we have an expectations of privacy in our homes, and I don't think universally, most people would stop a police officer from coming into their home, even though they're legally entitled to. But still, I can see that there's a problem with that particular tool being abused if there were not the proper safeguards.
There's a couple of issues that you brought up, one being excessive force and whether or not police officers are in fact using too much force today. And I think it depends on the situation. The one thing I would notice about Eric Gardner, and I do understand the broken windows theory that the police officers are operating under, but I think a lot of police officers believe that they absolutely have to make an arrest when they see something wrong. And in making that arrest, and this is one thing the police commissioner said, he said in terms of Eric Gardner, that Eric Gardner did not have a right to resist arrest. Well, that's true. But if you saw the film, his resisting was pushing the officer's hands down like this. Now, as a result of that effort, that movement, he died. Now, making real simple analysis, would it be better for the police officers to have ignored the fact this man was standing on a corner selling a loose cigarette without tax, or that incident resulted in someone's death? There were certainly some other options available to the police. They do have training, they have mace, they have tasers. The chokehold is very unpredictable, particularly if you use a nightstick or anything like that, very unpredictable. So the net result is that he died. The one thing police officers also have to keep in mind is they're given the authority to enforce the law by the people in the government, but if there's no law violation, technically, there's no authority. If I don't see anybody do anything wrong, I have no authority to do anything to them. I was a policeman for 35 years. I never considered arresting anybody for selling one cigarette, even if it was a crime, even if it was a minor crime. There's other things that I could have been doing that really would have made a difference in that city, and particularly if I knew the person. There are many times we let someone go and arrest them or send them a summons later on when they cool down. You don't have to do something right now, particularly when it's that dangerous. In terms of the police and the use of military equipment now, I was Director of Public Safety on 9/11. I felt very, very inadequate because we had people flying planes into buildings. I thought it was ironic because the mayor called a meeting on the 25th floor of the city county building. I said, Mayor, the basement's not open? Why the 25th floor? We were not equipped to deal with that. Many police officers and firefighters died as a result of that, trying to rescue people. And I think today many police officers think that because of the terrorist threat, they need these tanks and other equipment that are in fact military. During the peaceful protest in Ferguson, I thought it was ironic that people were walking around, saying, what they were saying, hands up, and the police were patrolling in tanks for people that were unarmed. What were they going to do with a tank? It's totally unnecessary, and I think it's overkill, and I think that goes to the leadership, it goes to the government, to try to not just train their police officers, but control them so that they understand that sometimes it's better to let somebody escape than to kill them, especially if it's a minor crime.
I just want to lift up an example in 1999, in January of 1999, just after holiday time, a lot of police officers took their vacation, and the officers who happened to be available on a Saturday night when a few rowdy youth were coming out of the mall happened to be our riot squad in jumpsuits. And when they were called to address these youth were getting out of hand, most of the time the police officers would just come, stand on the sidewalk, and the kids would move along because they see their officers. But to show up in half of your riot gear just inflamed the situation, so even the news was reporting that it was a riot. Well, it escalated to a point where it was close to being a riot, if I can remember the story correctly. But it was a situation that if we had had our regular uniformed police officers show up, everything would have been fine. So there is such a thing as wearing the appropriate gear. You know, you don't wear a hockey uniform to a basketball game. And so the opposite is also true, that there are situations where there are criminals that have militarized equipment, and I don't want our officers to be out there outgunned and not be able to protect themselves appropriately. And with the appropriate training, with the appropriate equipment, and understanding what that situation is and the tactical needs of the situation, they can address it quite effectively. Sometimes it takes armament. We have a nice Humvee that's well equipped to go through pretty much anything. I don't know if you've seen it before, but it's very impressive. I'm glad they have it, because if they have to go in someplace, I want them to come out safely. But it comes down to the training and the individuals who are using the equipment, making sure that they're using it wisely and well.
So delving into one of the cases we just discussed a little bit deeper, and maybe Judge Shaheed, we can turn this to you to start. What we've seen is that the grand jury trials involving police officers seem to rarely produce an indictment, as was the case with Darren Wilson and Ferguson. In that case, the prosecutor was criticized for allowing Wilson to testify and for presenting exculpatory evidence. In the 1992 Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Williams, Justice Scalia explained that the main role of a grand jury is to only examine upon which foundation the charge is made by the prosecutor. So the suspect under investigation by grand jury was never thought to have a right to testify or to have exculpatory evidence presented. However, according to the U.S. Attorney's Manual, the subject of a grand jury can be permitted by the prosecutor to testify. Do you believe there were any irregularities in the way that the Wilson grand jury trial was conducted, and if so, in what ways?
Well, the simple answer is no, because, and this is the big part, is that prosecutors, just like law enforcement officers, have wide discretion with respect to how they do their jobs. For example, I think we all know that unless I'm just dealing with a room full of saints, all of us have been stopped by a police officer, and some of us, sometimes we've gotten a ticket, sometimes not, because either we've said something that maybe caused the police officer to give us a second chance, or maybe it was just that he was being, or he or she was in a lenient mood, and so we got out of it without a ticket. That's discretion at the level of law enforcement, at the lowest level. By the same token, prosecutors have discretion. What happens with respect to prosecutors is that law enforcement officers put together a probable cause affidavit. That's what starts it. And then they put together a probable cause affidavit where they, based upon what they've seen, they feel that a crime has been committed. Then it is up to prosecutor screening, not just the prosecutor in the community, but the prosecutor has assigned deputy prosecutors that screen these probable cause affidavits, and then they go through the list. Out of all the probable cause affidavits that are filed in a city like Indianapolis, there are a lot filed on a daily basis. There is a screening officer or officers, and they're going through these probable cause affidavits to say, this one is a crime, this one is not, this one is not. And so what happens is there's a small category of cases where a grand jury is an option available to the prosecutor to determine, do I want to have people from the community come and listen to this evidence to determine whether or not a crime has been committed. Now, the whole idea of a grand jury, there's an expense associated with it, there's time associated with it, so you have to consider what are the reasons why a prosecutor would use this unique opportunity to determine whether or not a crime has been committed in that community. And the other part that is questionable to people that are familiar with the law, familiar with law enforcement and prosecutorial discretion, is why would a prosecutor allow a defendant to testify at a grand jury hearing? I would say this. I would doubt if any defendant charged with a drug offense has ever had the opportunity to testify at a grand jury hearing. And I think most of us would probably answer probably not, because normally what the prosecutor is trying to do is to get an indictment so that they can have the charges filed so that they can take the person to court. So it appears from everything that I've seen that the prosecutor really didn't want to have a criminal prosecution with respect to that case in terms of the police officer. And there are many reasons for that. One is that there's a very close working relationship between the prosecutor and the police department, because the police department is the department that is bringing the crimes to the prosecutor to determine which ones to prosecute. And it's those police officers that have to testify for the prosecutor to get a conviction. In other words, there's a very close working relationship between the prosecutor's office and the police department. And then the other part is, I think in the background with respect to the case in Ferguson, is there were attorneys associated with the family of Michael. And it was very clear, and I know these attorneys because they're from Florida, and they've also represented other families associated with excessive force cases. I think the prosecutor was also concerned that a civil action was going to come against the city of Ferguson, if there was an indictment and if there was a conviction. So there were a number of issues at work that I think caused the grand jury to proceed as it did in Ferguson.
Thank you.
The grand jury is a tool that the prosecutor can use. He doesn't have to. And I find that in a situation like Ferguson, the prosecutor was between a rock and a hard place. Had he simply charged the police officer, the police department would have been mad at him. Had he not charged the police officer, the community would have been mad at him. So whatever happens, he can blame it on the grand jury. But the prosecutor can also control the grand jury to a great extent by calling whatever witnesses and asking the questions that he wants to ask. So it's been said the prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich if he wants to. Another concern I had for Ferguson is Ferguson was not the typical American community. Ferguson had a predominant population that was black, but they were not police officers, they were not firefighters, they were not government officials. A lot of them couldn't vote or didn't vote. So this was a community that was in imbalance anyway, and I have to believe that that imbalance would affect the grand jury and any other jury. So I don't think that this was necessarily a fundamentally fair process. The prosecutor's job is to determine if he wants to prosecute. That's what he should have done in that case. And I feel that's the same thing with the U.S. attorney, et cetera. That's their job. And they should move forward with it and ultimately let a jury decide.
Thank you. So for our final question, what our conversation today seems to highlight is a continued problem of racial profiling in this country. Proponents of racial profiling have argued that it helps identify criminals and fight crime. However, statistics have shown that racial profiling actually makes police less accurate in catching criminal activity because resources are being wasted on false positives. The focus becomes on race rather than one on the clues that could actually lead to identifying the criminal. Additionally, though the goal of racial profiling is to make communities more safe, what in effect is happening is that communities become less safe because individuals have a mistrust of law enforcement and don't feel safe reporting crimes. Both current and past administrations have recognized this, and conversations have been ongoing both at the local and national levels about this. When President Bush took office, he introduced the End Racial Profiling Act, requiring federal agencies to stop this practice and local agencies that wanted federal money to do the same. The events of 9/11, however, put the plan on halt as some agencies felt the need to profile Muslims in airports. The recent shootings of the African Americans previously mentioned tonight have, however, revived this discussion on the need to end racial profiling, as evidenced by Attorney General Eric Holder's response to the tension in Ferguson. However, it seems that this progress seems to be incremental. What do you believe, and this is open to anyone on the panel, what do you believe is the next step in addressing and one day eradicating racial profiling by state and federal authorities? Do you believe it starts at the federal level with legislation, or is there something that can be done initially at the local level? And is there a place for a reconciliation process in all of this to help address the mistrust between the African American population and the police?
Well, in terms of racial profiling, and since I've been a policeman, I've certainly heard that said. There are times when a police officer is given information that a black man committed a robbery, he's driving a certain car, and really wouldn't do him a lot of good to look for a white man in that situation. He's got to focus on the description he's given. So we have to understand what racial profiling is. It's not looking for a certain person that fits a certain description, but it's characterizing a certain person because he looks a certain way. And that is a concern I've heard expressed, particularly in terms of policing, but it's not just police, because if you look at the Trayvon Martin situation, that was racial profiling. This is a kid that was walking through a neighborhood eating Skittles and drinking a Mountain Dew, and he had a hood on, and he ended up dead. And the person that killed him was not indicted by a grand jury and was not charged. And some people in America say that was justice. I don't see how. And I always put myself in situations, but if you put me in that same neighborhood as a black man who was self-appointed as a security guard in that community, and I saw a white female wearing that same hood, eating Skittles and drinking Mountain Dew, and I ended up shooting her, where do you think I'd be? I assure you I wouldn't be here.
I almost don't even know where to start with that question. I do have some questions about reconciliation because I'm really interested in justice, and I'm not so sure that reconciliation really brings us full circle to that process, especially since we're talking about equality and justice for everyone. So we have a lot of issues to address before we're willing to go into that process, but perhaps I don't understand it completely. Also, this idea of this vigilantism that I think that existed in this Trayvon Martin case, but also with regard to issues of racial profiling, because it comes up in that way also. So it's not just police, but it's also citizens that take it upon themselves to think they're doing something that benefits society in terms of issues of security. So it's Latinos that are being targeted with regard to issues of immigration, or Muslims being targeted with issues concerning the war on terror. But it's those that are not trained, that just have some ideas in their mind about who fits these profiles, that then will pick up this excessive weaponry that we have in this country, which speaks to this other issue that we haven't fully addressed, which is the level of guns that we have in this country. We cannot have a peaceful society with the gun violence that we have that's just rampant. And obviously, that's something that we need to have more conversations about because we just have too many guns in this country, and it speaks to why we have violence, and then it also speaks to why the police then think that they need more equipment because everyone else is getting more guns. And then I do want to also, I feel like since the last question, I have to go back to a couple of points in terms of stop and frisk, because it also speaks to again, to the war on terror and the Patriot Act, where we've been so willing to give up our own civil liberties and subject ourselves in the idea or the belief of having enhanced security to giving up some of our rights to a certain extent and being willing to be, stopped and frisked, or to be patted down, or to go through, all of the excessive equipment that we need to make sure no one's carrying weapons. We need to pull back from that, because I don't know if it's actually meeting the intent of what it supposedly was, especially if it's affecting people of color disproportionately. The ACLU, and since I'm a part of the ACLU, I have to bring that organization up. They have looked at a lot of these issues in terms of not just from the legal standpoint, but also with regard to issues of educating the public about how we can really all participate in this idea of what we really need as a society to be safe, but then also to protect our own rights. And it's an ongoing conversation and discussion. But when we do have all the statistics that suggest that people of color are being unfairly targeted, then we do need to all work together to address all the laws that we have in place that are violating, all the rights and making our society unequal. So it happens at all levels.
I would just like to thank the Desmond Tutu Center for orchestrating this conversation. I think this is probably an important step toward improving the environment for law enforcement and the communities that we live in. I think in many respects there are cultural issues at play with respect to profiling generally. The more we understand about people that are different from ourselves, either from the standpoint of race, religion, even men, women, the more we come to understand people that are different from ourselves, the better the overall environment will be, so that instead of profiling, we just look at that's our neighbor. And they may be of a different race, they may be of a different sect, different religion, different country of origin, but the more I understand about that person and the culture that they come from, the less I'm inclined to stereotype what their reaction is or what they may be up to. And typically when there's a question about who somebody is, that's when the questions and the fear set in. What are they up to? What are they about? Are they going to hurt me? Are they going to do something to interfere with my freedoms, my property, and so forth? So I think the Desmond Tutu Center is doing a great work by engaging and encouraging these kinds of conversations.
I think he hit it right on the head, especially as he talked about the cultural differences. As a black man in America, I wear a suit probably 75% of my time now. But even in a suit, I've gotten on the elevator and had somebody, a young lady, a lady of another race, take her purse, switch it to the other side, and give it an extra tug. I'm not sure what she would think I would do, but is her fear really founded? I've had ladies gather their kids closer to them when they see me. Most of the time I keep myself pretty well groomed. Every once in a while my mustache is a little crooked. But we live in a country where racism is still prevalent in subtle and not so subtle ways. So until we get to a point where we're not teaching our children how to be racist, when we get to a point where the quote-unquote equality of an individual is not the question, it shouldn't be questioned, but have the opportunity to have real dialogue about the human nature of individuals, who they are, we will never solve these problems. Sure, there's room for reconciliation, but you have to have a willing heart to get to a point where a reconciliation discussion can happen. as a young man, I delivered pizzas. And about 3 months into working for my boss, he said, I just want to apologize. And I said, well, why? Because I grew up in Arkansas and I was part of the Ku Klux Klan. That was what they did. It was like Boy Scouts to them. So he didn't have any idea that, you know, there was something wrong with that thought process until he got outside of the microcosm that he lived in. The same goes for everybody. We have to get outside of our boxes and experience the relationship with other people on a one-on-one level. That's where we stop racism. And that's where a lot of violence will end between races, between religions, is having those relationships. But until we commit ourselves one by one to having those relationships, to having that dialogue, then reconciliation will never happen. And we will continue to use generic terms like racial profiling instead of going deeper and getting to the root cause of these issues.
Thank you. So now we'll open up the floor to questions. Please raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you. Where's Ann? Okay, back in the room. And in order to get into as many questions as possible, we just ask that you please limit yourself to one question. Who's the daring first person?
Thanks so much for all your thoughts and life experiences that are behind those thoughts. You mentioned the word root causes. I'm just wondering if maybe each of you would talk about one root cause that you feel strongly about, that you feel is really driving the reason why we're having this conversation at all.
Actually, I think the one root cause that I would identify, it actually is not racism. It is, and particularly in terms of the police, it's lack of training, not understanding your authority, to a great extent a lot of arrogance, and to some extent some ignorance. Because when you look at some situations, like for example the young man, I think his name was Tamir Rice, that was killed in Cleveland, I believe, a 12-year-old with a toy gun. I don't believe that even a racist could shoot down a 12-year-old kid like that. Everybody shouldn't be a policeman. Sometimes you have to take risk. But that policeman, had he simply, based on the information he had, not pulled up immediately next to this house or little cabana where the kid was, but pulled out 20, 30 yards, got out on the other side of the car, or shielded himself and told the kid, listen, put the gun down and walk toward me. Pulling up next to it created a problem. He jumps out, the kid pulls the gun, and he immediately fires. Within a couple of seconds, the kid's dead. I don't think that he was a racist. I just don't think he understood how to be a policeman. I also find that in that case, also with the Eric Gardner case, even a semi-trained policeman would be smart enough to know that once you shoot somebody, the first thing you do is give first aid. The first thing you do. But he didn't administer first aid to the kid. In Eric Gardner, they didn't administer first aid. They kind of patted him and said, you'll be okay. But I've been in similar situations here in Indianapolis. One, a homicide at 22nd and Alabama, where a man was clearly dead. Massive head wound. He'd been dead probably a half hour, but his family's here screaming, why don't you help him? And you find yourself giving artificial respiration to somebody that's dead. A horrible feeling, but I felt worse not doing anything. So for them to sit there and shoot a kid and then do nothing tells me he had no clue what he was supposed to do. He should not have been a policeman. And I found in Indianapolis and in other cities, not just police officers, but also police chiefs are hired based on politics, not based on qualification, education, their ability to run the department. It's politics. And that's the worst thing in the world we could do.
racism. We have a very racist society, and it infuses every aspect in this country in terms of education, also economic inequality, the lack of fair housing, which is a critical issue, the lack of the ability of everyone to participate politically. We have some real issues with regard to voting suppression, also based on race. And we also have some issues in the criminal justice system, which we've been talking about, also that are aligned with the racist system and structures that we have in place. And I'm only suggesting that because you said to pick one, because if I had to really unpack it a little bit more, I would say that we have, sort of racism and socioeconomic issues, and also some issues of gender that are all in kind of sort of intersecting and working together to create all of these disparities that exist in our society. But since you said pick one, that's the biggest one, racism.
The one I would talk about, since I want to pick something different from what the other panelists have mentioned thus far, and that's the education piece. And I think, as Professor Jett said, the problems really start in the educational system, and I was impressed with her data with respect to suspensions, expulsions, special ed in the school system, in the elementary school system. I remember many years ago, the commissioner of the Department of Corrections at the time said that they anticipate the prison beds that are going to be needed in the future by the at-risk students in the 3rd grade. The number of at-risk students in the 3rd grade was their measure for what they were going to need in the way of prison beds in the future. So that says that, to me, that if we want to fix things, we really need to go back to the very beginnings with respect to education, because I think there's been some data that indicates that, in particular for African-American males, they start to disengage, they start to turn off from school in the 3rd, 4th grade. So if they start to not feel part of the system in the 3rd grade, what are their chances for going to Harvard, Yale, or MIT, or even being able to read, get out of high school reading? So I think we really need to concentrate on fixing our school system so that it gives everyone a chance at being the best person that they can be in society.
Since I have to pick a different one, I'll pick the world map. If you look at the world map that we are used to, it is skewed to the northern hemisphere, and the southern hemisphere is diminished. The real world map shows the southern hemisphere as a larger section of land masses than the northern hemisphere. What does that mean? That means that we've been looking at a misshapen identity of people from the southern hemisphere. Who's in the southern hemisphere? People of color. So if you look at from the equator south, if you've diminished or distorted the view of those people all over the world, and that's what you're teaching our children, then not only the children here in America that are of color or of no color, which is not really true, but if you're teaching, there's a devaluation. They're smaller, they're lesser, they're not as important. They didn't have as big a contribution in history. When it's just the opposite, then you have confused kids of every race and gender. And now we're wondering why we have problems. If we were to educate honestly on our history, there's more than enough to be proud of. Absolutely more than enough to be proud of. For everybody, for every race. If you look at America, American history is rich with flavors of people that have contributed in magnificent ways. But that's not what we learn. And that's not what we're teaching our kids. So we have to battle the education system in order to make sure that our kids know the truth about the groups that are here. The Native Americans, the West Indies, the South Americans, Africans, Europeans, everybody has had a wonderful contribution to America and has made this a successful place. And we have to continue that legacy of telling our kids, one by one and as a group.
Thank you. Next question.
Good evening. What impacts do you think community policing or over policing inner city neighborhoods, what impact do you think that has on racial profiling? And if you believe it does have an impact, what solutions are there in stopping the term over-policing in neighborhoods of color?
So from a community guide type of a thing, if there's a crime that happens in my neighborhood and I call the police, I definitely want them to come. If it takes them 20 minutes to get there, then the problem is gone, or it's escalated to a situation that's out of control. So in some ways, there is the opportunity to focus in on areas where there is a concentration of criminal activity, but the way that the focus happens doesn't have to be one-dimensional. It can be multi-dimensional. And here in Indianapolis, we released a hotspot map, which is probably not the easiest thing for our communities to see, but at the same time, there's a strategy that goes along with using these hotspots as focal points, not just as policing mechanisms, but what are the social services that need to happen there? From the cradle to career. How do we impact lives? How do we have a collective impact? What are the social services that are needed? And many times it's our police officers who are at a home that can connect the family to the next level of services that helps move the family beyond the situation that they're in to improve the quality of their lives for themselves and their children, and to help them into a future. You wouldn't believe the number of calls I get from police officers who say, hey, where's the closest food pantry? Or this mother needs help with the school fees. Who can she call? Or they need heat, assistance with heat. Those officers aren't just keyed in on crime. They're keyed in on quality of life issues that help change that neighborhood for the better. Oh, and having more isn't always the answer. More officers isn't always the answer. It's having the good trained officers out there whose eyes are trained beyond crime.
Anybody else, or should I move on?
Oh, sure.
Community policing is a term that was coined probably, made popular maybe 20 years ago. And every policeman works in a community. That's not what it means. It means actually that the department and the city have a program where policemen work with the community to solve problems, not just crime, but problems. The problem that is created, however, when you go to community policing is it actually requires twice the manpower that you had. Because when you have community policing, you're not supposed to stop your normal patrols. You're still supposed to patrol and fight crime, but you also have people in the community working with the community to solve problems, to close drug houses, the things like that. Usually the city doesn't have the resources to actually implement community policing. So they implement a hodgepodge of other things, some of them call hotspots. But the term, I don't want anybody to tell me I live in a hotspot, because what that means is my spot's going to be hotter because police are going to be there. So you have to be careful how you label these things. Community policing is supposed to be just the opposite. And actually, in terms of the effect of community policing on a community, a top priority for any city should be, since you want to solve problems in your community, hire the people in the community. One of the main problems in Ferguson was they didn't. The police department, the fire department, the government, nobody. very underrepresented, a majority city, very underrepresented. Reminds you of South Africa. Remember how terrible South Africa once was? You know how nice it is now? It's the same people. It was the mentality. But here in Indianapolis, we find ourselves doing lateral transfers. We go to Bedford or we go to Louisville and we bring in people from other places. And I've got nothing against those people, but if you bring somebody in from Bedford that grew up in a farming community, there's no blacks there. You get together every once in a while, you go out and, you know, you plow the fields and you hang out at the local, you know, dairy bar with the guys. But when you come to Indianapolis and you see 10 guys standing on the corner that are black, you think it's a problem. They're up to something, simply because you're not familiar with Indianapolis. So why don't cities hire their own? I don't understand that. I was very confused when the mayor brought in the public safety director from Louisville. He's a nice guy. I got nothing against him. But he might know more about Louisville than he does Indianapolis. And the one before came from Plains, New York. And then the chief came from Baltimore. How is it that you have people here, you're talking about community policing, yet you ignore the people who have been on your department for 20 and 30 years who know Indianapolis, and you bring in somebody that doesn't know where Monument Circle is, and you talk about community policing? Politics.
I think in terms of this community, we also had a real problem when the sheriff and the city police, when they merged. And when I first moved here, and I've only lived here 15 years, but they used to have like district offices, and I'm not suggesting that that was necessarily community policing, because I think I still haven't witnessed it here, but it seemed like the police were more visible in various areas kind of throughout the city, where now you just see a lot of different police going, you know, different places. You're not really sure what jurisdiction they're covering. I'm not even sure if they know what they're covering. But I sure see some nice police cars, some new fancy cars that they're driving around, but I'm not sure, you know, what exactly they're doing with all of that. So I think that the idea of community policing is interesting, where you would have police more visible within communities other than just policing the neighborhoods, but having a real presence and interacting with people. They used to have a program, I think it was a federal program also, called Police Next Door and Teacher Next Door, where they would provide incentives for police and teachers they would give them some breaks in terms of acquiring housing in various neighborhoods, and they would have a nice presence there and be a part of the community. And I believe they did away with that program maybe about 15 years ago or so. Somebody might know more about that. But if we did, you know, have better relationships, and we could address some of the trust issues that come with the relationship between various communities and the various law enforcement agencies. And I think just in Marion County or in this area alone, it seems like we have about 20 police agencies. There might be more than that. When you think about all the different schools that have police, we have our own police force here. You think about the school police, the townships, they have police, the sheriffs, there's state police, there's also Capitol cops, there's state troopers. You know, we really should be pretty safe considering all of the police that we have. So, you know, something has gone wrong.
Okay, I think I saw a question. Charlie, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was recently, well, first I want to thank
I think the mic is coming, sorry.
Yeah, thanks again to the Desmond Tutu Center for this great conversation and for the collective wisdom and experience on the panel. I was recently at another conversation similar to this with Chief Height, and he mentioned when he sends his officers out, his men and women out, sometimes he feels like they're out to support a caste system. And we didn't talk a lot about societal issues, and I just wonder, is there an undue focus on the police? Because some of the egregious acts that we see, and I know the ones that we don't see, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but how much of it is a societal problem, and how much focusing on the police do you think, is there too much focus on the police, not enough focus on what we as citizens and what we as a society should be doing to address some of these issues?
Well, I think you pose a good question. Because for somebody that's been in the judicial system for basically 20 years. There's an aspect of it that is racial, but then there's also an aspect that is socioeconomic. In other words, what you tend to see, especially with respect to the spectrum of crime, I think most often people focus on violent crime because that's what the media focuses on. That's what our entertainment programs are centered around, how to get away with murder, law and order, and so forth like that. But with respect to the court system, the majority of the criminal activity is at the lower level. In other words, misdemeanors, which would be associated with operating under the influence, possession of marijuana for the first time, domestic violence, those kinds of offenses take up more time than the more violent crimes. And so when you look at the criminal activity, you'll see that it is, for the most part, kind of spread across the community in terms of Hispanic, African American, white, and so forth. And so in those areas of crime, we see that if someone is without education and without a support system, they're more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So yes, there's a racial component to it, but also there's a socioeconomic component to it. And again, that's why I focus on the education piece, because where education fails, it fails everybody. Whether they're black, Hispanic, white, male, female. If our education fails to give people opportunities for upward mobility, we have a default system, and the default system is the criminal justice system. So if people have mental health issues and don't have a support system, they end up in the criminal justice system. If somebody doesn't have an education, can't get a job, and end up trying to take care of babies that they don't have a job to support, they end up in the criminal justice system. So our criminal justice system is a catch-all when society fails people in giving them opportunities to sustain themselves.
Anything else? Any other questions? I think we have one over here. A few, actually. We can start with the gentleman in the third row. I think he had his hand up first.
Thank you. I believe the question was asked earlier about, was it Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and things like that? And so I have a question about that in conjunction with, was it racial sensitivity training spoken of earlier? I was raised in Connecticut and lived in different parts of the country, largely in white communities. But from the beginning, I was raised in such a way that philosophically I found racism repugnant. But moving to a city like Indianapolis for the first time a couple of years ago, I've found greater racial tension within myself than ever before, just because I have the opportunity to interact with the issues more, but also know some African American people, some of them my close friends. But nevertheless, I discover that not everything is it's not enough to simply want to be friendly with one another, because there is tension that goes back generations. There are some in the African community who have a great deal of resentment, understandably so, given the treatment of the African American community. And so I find that the issue the problem with racism is more than just a philosophical one, whether or not it's justified. Certainly it's not. But there are deeper issues of the human heart involved. And so my question has to do with how we can overcome this together in society. I mean, I don't know that we can we really just legislate racism away without human hearts changing? And how are human hearts going to change unless we find a way to break down the walls and to become familiar, really familiar with one another? I find that I would like to ask more question of my black friends, but I'm embarrassed that I don't already know the answers to the questions, so I don't. And I see students where I go to school still kind of staying separate and not really being familiar with one another's cultures. And so what are some practical ways that we really can change human hearts and get to know one another?
A lot of times it comes down to leadership, whether it's at the university level or the classroom level, of being purposeful about interaction and designing interaction so that people can offer up opportunities to break down their own barriers. If I break down somebody else's barrier, then I'm seen as an invader. If somebody takes down their own barrier, then they're seeing progress within themselves, right? So having the opportunity to create those safe environments. Charlie Wiles and several folks are here from the Center for Interfaith Cooperation. Wasima has done a fantastic job picking up the ball and running with it. And that's a way in the faith arena that we can have some pretty tense dialogue, actually. And it's not that we come to the room thinking that we all have a great understanding of everybody's faith, because we don't. But we've created a safe space that we can have the discussion about faith and ask the questions that might seem silly to some. But the Center for Interfaith Cooperation does a team group where the teens go to different houses of worship, and the teens get a chance to talk about their faith and what it means to them. So pieces like that are very intentional and focused on making sure that the relationships are created. And good professors, I've had a couple in my life, have created situations, whether it's through projects, team projects, where they select the team members and things that will give them the opportunity to engage with one another, and then create those additional safe spaces that people can actually make mistakes in their thought process or what have you. But if it's not a safe space, if somebody's going to get punished, then it'll never happen. But it's up to the leadership to make some of those things happen.
I think the difficulty is that America has a very difficult history, and when you think about it, I was doing some research on another project, and it was just 50 years ago that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. I grew up, in a time when it really wasn't safe to go on the other side of Washington Street, let alone go into Mississippi, Alabama, some of those states. The Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965. So there's a lot of baggage, that people in my generation have, and some of that gets passed along, to my kids. At least that's what they tell me. But I think the bright point is that it's a natural circumstance for you to work with African Americans, and where you have a natural interaction in terms of living, going to lunch with, going to go to concerts and so forth like that, and then just live as people. Those situations will take care of themselves as we get to know one another. But I don't think you can have a specific conversation or wave any kind of magic wand and then have, hundreds of years of history and pain and mistrust, just add all the words you want to add, just go away. They're just not going to evaporate. Those things will, over time, take care of themselves. But I think that the most positive thing that we can do is just learn to interact with the people that we can and just be genuine friends because those situations in a more natural way will bring about reconciliation. I think the other than forums like this, where people have a chance to kind of talk about issues, I just think the natural interaction where just working with people causes us to recognize that basically we're all looking for the same thing, a better situation for our children than what we had, and then just an opportunity to live in peace with each other.
It's a very difficult question to answer, especially because we know that your own socialization does take place at a very early age, and so it's hard to control what's going on in families. One just sort of practical way to address some of the differences and understanding one another would be if we lived with one another, and we don't. We have very segregated communities in this country, and so that's just kind of one practical way. If we had more mixed housing and neighborhood, more diverse communities, then that would be one way where we wouldn't need to go through a re-education process later on in life because you would have grown up with people and been able to with diverse people and been able to understand them. As a university professor, since it was discussed addressing in the classroom, it takes a lot of work to re-educate someone who has been miseducated by the time they get to my classroom. Because we're talking about, 18 years or more of, a lot of misunderstanding or things that they've been taught or things they've heard within their family that they then bring into the classroom. And so there's only so much that I can do to address that, and I can't force, relationships to happen. So, that's, it's also, it has to be the individual that has a willingness themselves to recognize the world that they live in and to think about, what would be better for our society looking at the big picture, and it would be to have a better understanding with one another. I was horrified when I heard they were eliminating social studies from the testing. First of all, I don't necessarily agree with testing, but if you're going to eliminate something, that is not the thing to eliminate.
I don't understand racism. I've been the victim of it, and sometimes even when I'm not, I think I am because I've been the victim so many times, and I can't explain how it feels to know that you're the best and not get an opportunity, know that you worked as hard as you could and studied and not get an opportunity. It really hurts. But when you think of racism, it's not something new to the human race. I think some of the most critical, examples of horrific racism came with the philosophy of Hitler with the Jews. And you're talking about people that lived in a society together until some leader told them they shouldn't like the other one. So at some point you have to be astute enough, as I became as an individual, to know that something's just not right. And as a person, as a policeman, as a lawyer, I have just convinced myself that I'm not going to do anything that I don't think is right. I don't care if it costs me my job or whatever. I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to discriminate. I'm not going to hate. I'm going to treat everybody as well as I can under the circumstances. So I think it's an individual thing. I think the leaders have complicated it because they decide that if you're a Sunni, you should hate the Shiites. And it doesn't make any sense. If you're a Jew, you should hate the Muslims. It really is totally irrational, but it's gone on since humans were here. We even have ugly discrimination now, where the good-looking people hate the ugly people, and the small people hate the big people. We're humans. We're smarter than that. Stop doing it. That's all you have to do. Just stop doing it.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there a question up? Okay, right there. Everyone's being friendly.
Okay. So you guys talked a little bit about like reconciling differences between communities affected by like police brutality and the police themselves, but how do we reconcile those differences when it's not only like profit that's driving these differences and like this distrust in these communities, but it's like the very society that we live in like insulates like this type of thinking, and also like a myriad of other factors like that's intersectional that all like act to bring about like this distrust in the community. So how do we bring about that reconciliation between the communities and the police?
I think that Mr. Turner hit on something that was very important, and that it's been here ever since. There's always an ism that drives differences. Blue eye against brown eye. The people know the experiment that happened in classrooms. Irish against Catholics. I was really confused by that one. It's like, wait a minute, they're all white. What are they doing? So there's the lines that we draw as human beings. Many times it's to protect privilege. Plain and simply, I want to pass on privilege that I've gained in my lifetime to my children, whether it's financial, bless you, whether it's financial or position-wise. And so we began to create these rules around how do I protect my privilege for my children, so my children have access to that privilege. And those are the isms that we utilize to control the privilege part. And so once you get over yourself and realize that the equality issue, right, has room to be more than me protecting my privilege. In other words, why aren't there more African American police officers? Well, there's been a tremendous effort by the police department to recruit more African American police officers, but there's been a level of distrust that has gone in to that situation as well. So it's not enough just to say we're done with privilege. It's not enough to even say that there's equality. There has to be consistent effort to keep doors open and keep minds open to the discussion of opportunity for those that are in a community. With Ferguson, there was also the responsibility. They had 30% registered to vote of their possible voting population, which is about average here in the United States, which is a shame, right? So we all have a responsibility to protect our freedom by being engaged in the community, which is what we're asking our police officers to do as well. Protect our freedom by being engaged in our community. And for each of us, we also have to be engaged in our political system. If you haven't voted, you have no right to complain, right? So as difficult as it is sometimes to vote, rain, long lines, all that stuff, there are ways that you can make sure that you're informed and engaged, so that you are making choices that help protect your freedom and protect your rights. So all these things pile into saying, I'm breaking down the barriers that are around me and opening up doors. And I'm hoping that each person takes the responsibility and the opportunity to break down those barriers for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a process. I think we're better than we were. We're still not where we need to be. But I think the key thing is that to recognize in America we have a participatory democracy. And I think a lot of times young people may take that for granted. I'm not saying youth particularly, but when you look around the world, in particular, like China, Russia, they don't have the freedoms that we have. And because I think young people in particular just kind of grew up knowing that you had the right to vote, that you had freedom of speech, that you could elect the people who were going to be the mayor, the president, and so forth. You kind of take those issues for granted. But if you want to change the system in a positive way, you have to participate so that the leaders are held accountable. In other words, there'll be a mayoral election next year. The mayor is the one that basically sets the tone for what the police department will be like. So if you want to have a voice in that process, go to those debates, go to those conversations where the people are going to be running for mayor and ask, what is your policy with respect to how the police department treats African American communities? What is your position with respect to African Americans on the police department? What is your position with respect to more women in the police department at higher offices? When you have more people asking those questions, then the elected officials are held more accountable to you for how they conduct their offices. By the same token, for the prosecutor, you know, if you're concerned about the discretion a prosecutor has and how that's exercised, ask the people that are running for those offices those kinds of questions. That's how, as a community, we hold our elected officials accountable to us for how they exercise their discretion and their authority.
I like that word accountability because what exactly do we want to reconcile? We want to have accountability in the system. We need some systematic adjustments in terms of unfairness and inequality. We need to address some economic issues, disparities that are infused and affect the system. And so if we're talking about reconciliation in terms of, and I don't know, but in terms of us all kind of living together peacefully, then there's some structural issues that we need to address in order to get to that point, because we can't just sort of forgive and forget. You know, we have to think about, have an understanding of the historical construct that has taken place that affects what is going on today. And then we also need to have some real changes that happen so that we do have a more just system and a system that allows more equal opportunity and that also allows greater political participation that is not based on wealth, that is based on you being a citizen in this country. So, here we go.
I don't think that I can add anything to what has been said. I think when you talk about racism, I guess I think about people like Martin Luther King, who was nonviolent, and that was his motto. He was not going to be violent. Even when people hit him with bricks, called him names, he was peaceful. But somebody shot him and killed him. I can't negotiate with a person that killed someone that was unarmed and nonviolent. I can't convince him that his mentality about racism is wrong. It has to come from within him. And that's why I say at some point we have to realize that we are human. We have our own minds and our own hearts, and we should try to do the right thing individually.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but if any people have any questions, you're welcome to submit your questions on the Desmond Tutu Center's website, and Waseema will help coordinate and get answers for you from the panelists. So I just want to thank everyone for attending tonight, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for their insight. And a thank you to the sponsors of tonight's event as well. Have a good evening.
Mr. Harrison, it's always good to see you.
Absolutely, pleasure.
Oh, wow.